For 15 years, I was a ghost to my own parents. My text messages went unanswered, my wedding invitations were ignored, and my existence was nothing but a mild inconvenience. Until a freezing Tuesday in November, when my doorbell rang. Standing on my porch were the two people who erased me, suddenly begging for the one thing they swore they'd never need: my mercy. To understand the absolute audacity of what my parents eventually asked of me, you have to understand the hierarchy of the Sterling household. We lived in a sprawling, colonial-style house on Arlington Avenue in Upper Arlington, Ohio. To the outside world, my parents, Richard and Brenda Sterling, were the picture of Midwestern success. My father owned Sterling Freight and Logistics, a mid-sized trucking and supply chain company that had cornered a lucrative regional market. My mother was a fixture in local philanthropic circles, always hosting charity galas for Nationwide Children's Hospital. But behind the heavy oak doors of our home, the family dynamic was a brutal dictatorship, and the golden child was the sole beneficiary. His name was Preston. He was 3 years younger than me, born with our mother's striking blue eyes and our father's terrifying ability to charm his way out of any consequence. From the moment he could walk, the sun rose and set on Preston. If Preston wanted a customized Fender Stratocaster for his 12th birthday, my father worked overtime to buy it. When I asked for help paying for a modest used Honda Civic so I could commute to my after-school job, I was given a lecture on building character and fiscal responsibility. I was the quintessential glass child. I was quiet, made straight A's, never stayed out past curfew, and demanded nothing. Because I required no fixing, I received no attention. Preston, on the other hand, was a walking disaster, which meant he commanded all of their time, resources, and love. The disparities were staggering. When Preston barely graduated high school with a 2.1 GPA, my parents threw a catered party in the backyard with a live band. When I graduated high school in the top 10% of my class, they missed the ceremony because Preston had a very important lacrosse tournament in Indianapolis that weekend. They left a $20 bill on the kitchen counter with a sticky note that read, "Proud of you, Chloe. Order a pizza." I swallowed the hurt, assuming that if I just worked harder, they would eventually see me. I put myself through the Ohio State University, working full-time night shifts at a data entry center while carrying a full course load. Meanwhile, my parents bought Preston a brand new BMW and paid his out-of-state tuition to a private university in Florida, a university he flunked out of by his sophomore year after a string of frat party-related arrests. Every time Preston failed, my parents rushed in with the safety net. "He's just finding himself," my mother would coo, stroking his hair after bailing him out of the Franklin County Jail for a misdemeanor reckless driving charge. "He's got a brilliant mind. It just doesn't fit into the traditional academic box," my father would proclaim. The breaking point, the moment the invisible string tying me to my family finally snapped, happened when I was 24. I had been out of college for 2 years, working relentlessly at a tech startup in downtown Columbus. I lived in a tiny, drafty apartment and had scraped together $25,000. It was my life savings, the seed money I planned to use to relocate to Chicago and launch my own B2B software consulting firm. I was so proud of that bank account. It was my ticket out. Then came the phone call on a rainy Thursday night. It wasn't to ask how I was doing. It was my mother, her voice trembling with manufactured hysteria. "Chloe, we need you to come to the house immediately. It's an emergency." I drove over, my stomach in knots, only to find my parents sitting at our massive mahogany dining table. Preston was slouched in the corner, staring at his phone, looking utterly bored. Preston had taken one of the company's commercial flatbed trucks for a joyride while heavily intoxicated. He had crashed it into a local storefront, causing massive property damage and injuring a pedestrian. Because of his previous record, the prosecutor was out for blood. My parents needed to hire Robert C. Kessler, the most ruthless, expensive defense attorney in the state, to keep Preston out of state prison. "The retainer is $50,000, my father said, not looking me in the eye. "Business has been a little slow. Most of our cash is tied up in assets. We need your savings, Chloe. All of it." I stared at them, the silence in the room deafening. "You want me to empty my life savings, money I earned working 70-hour weeks, to keep Preston out of jail for a crime he absolutely committed? He is your brother," my mother shrieked, slamming her hand on the table. "This is family. We do whatever it takes for family." "You didn't even pay for my textbooks, Mom," I said, my voice eerily calm. "You didn't show up to my college graduation. You haven't asked me a single question about my life in 3 years. No, I am not giving you my money." Preston finally looked up from his phone, smirking. "Come on, Chloe. What are you even going to do with it? You're just sitting on it." "No," I repeated, standing up. My father stood too, his face purple with rage. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "If you walk out that door with your money while your brother faces a cage, you are no longer a Sterling. You are dead to us. Do you understand? Dead." "I've been dead to you my whole life," I replied. "Now it's just official." I walked out. They didn't come after me. I packed up my apartment 3 days later, moved to Chicago, and changed my phone number. For 10 years, I honored their decree. The silence was agonizing at first. During the holidays, I would walk past warmly lit houses in my Chicago neighborhood, seeing families gathered around tables, and a hollow ache would bloom in my chest. But as the years bled into one another, the grief morphed into an impenetrable armor. I channeled every ounce of my rejection into my ambition. I co-founded a software company called Aegis Flow, specializing in predictive analytics for supply chain management, ironically, the exact industry my father operated in. It turned out I had a genius for logistics that my father had never bothered to nurture. At 28, I met Liam. He was a corporate attorney who found my fierce independence intoxicating rather than intimidating. When we married, my side of the church was filled with friends, mentors, and colleagues. I hadn't sent invitations to Ohio. I didn't want the ghosts of Arlington Avenue haunting my new life. By the time I was 34, Aegis Flow was acquired by a massive global tech conglomerate. My payout was in the high 8 figures. I was financially secure beyond my wildest dreams, living in a beautifully restored historic home in Oak Park, Illinois, with Liam and our 2 golden retrievers. I was happy. I was healed. Or so I thought. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to me, the Sterling Empire was crumbling. I later pieced together what happened through mutual acquaintances and public records. My father, aging and stubborn, had made Preston the vice president of operations at Sterling Freight. It was a catastrophic error. Preston treated the company accounts like a personal ATM. He alienated key clients, botched massive delivery contracts, and poured company funds into ridiculous investments, like a failed crypto startup and a chain of disastrous boutique fitness centers. To cover Preston's mounting financial craters, my parents started taking out massive, high-interest loans against their home and their remaining business assets. But Preston's ultimate betrayal went much deeper. Desperate to maintain his lavish lifestyle as the company sank, he began forging my father's signature on federal loan applications and embezzling funds from the employee pension program. The house of cards finally collapsed. It was a freezing Tuesday in mid-November. The wind was howling off Lake Michigan, rattling the windows of my Oak Park home. I was sitting in my home office, sipping a latte and reviewing some angel investment portfolios, when the security chime echoed through the hallway. Liam was at the office, so I walked to the front door and pulled up the porch camera on my tablet. I stopped breathing. Standing on my porch, huddled against the biting Chicago wind, were two elderly strangers who wore the faces of my parents. They looked terrible. My father, once a hulking, imposing man who commanded every room, was hunched and frail, leaning heavily on a cane. My mother's trademark blonde hair was graying at the roots, her designer coat looking 2 sizes too big for her shrinking frame. My heart hammered against my ribs, a chaotic drumbeat of panic, rage, and a pathetic, deeply buried, childlike hope. I opened the door. The wind whipped between us. For a long moment, nobody spoke. "Chloe," my mother finally breathed, her eyes welling with tears. "You have a beautiful home." "How did you find me?" I asked, my voice devoid of warmth. "I didn't invite them in." "We hired a private investigator," my father rasped. His voice sounded like dry leaves scraping on concrete. "We've been keeping track of you, Chloe. We read about your company in Forbes. We are so proud of you." The blatant manipulation almost made me laugh. 15 years of silence, and you tracked me down because I made Forbes? What do you want, Richard? My mother flinched at the use of his first name. "Please, Chloe, it's freezing. Let us come inside. We have nowhere else to go." Against my better judgment, perhaps driven by a morbid curiosity to see how low they had sunk, I stepped aside. They shuffled into my warm, high-ceilinged foyer, looking around nervously, like trespassers. I led them to the living room but didn't offer them a seat. "Speak," I commanded. My father gripped his cane, his knuckles white. "Sterling Freight is gone. The bank seized the trucks last week. They're foreclosing on the house on Arlington Avenue in 14 days. I crossed my arms. That sounds like a failure of management. Where is your vice president of operations? My mother let out a choked sob. Preston is gone, Chloe. He fled. Fled? There was an audit, my father said, staring at the Persian rug beneath his feet. Preston was moving money. He drained the employee pension fund to pay off personal debts. He forged my name on federal relief loans. The FBI raided the corporate office 3 days ago. Preston took whatever cash was left in the safe and disappeared. They think he crossed the border into Mexico. I stood there, absorbing the absolute devastation of their golden child. The boy who could do no wrong had just destroyed their entire lives and left them to face the federal government alone. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, though I felt absolutely nothing. But I don't see how this concerns me. My mother stepped forward, reaching out a trembling hand to touch my sleeve. I stepped back before she could make contact. Chloe, the federal authorities are looking at your father. Because his signature is on the documents, they believe he was complicit. The legal fees, the restitution to the employees, it's millions of dollars. If we can't pay the restitution and hire a federal defense team, your father is going to die in a federal penitentiary. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with desperate, frantic pleading. We know you have the money, Chloe. You have more than enough. We need a loan. Just $4 million. To save your father's life. I stared at the woman who hadn't spoken to me in a decade and a half. I remembered the $25,000 I had slaved for. I remembered the door closing in my face. I remembered being told I was dead to them. You came to my home, I whispered, the venom finally leaking into my voice. After treating me like dirt on your shoes, for my entire life. After disowning me for not sacrificing my future for the criminal son you worshipped, to ask me for $4 million to save yourselves from the mess he made? You are our daughter, my father barked, a flash of his old, domineering self returning. We gave you life. You owe us. I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. You told me I was dead, Richard, and ghosts don't have bank accounts. You really should have learned how my software works before you tried to use it against me, Richard, I said softly. The smug, triumphant look on my father's face faltered. Just a fraction, but enough to show the cracks in his armor. What are you talking about? He snapped, his grip tightening on the head of his cane. Aegis Flow isn't just a database for shipping routes, I explained, stepping away from the coffee table and crossing my arms. It's a predictive anomaly detection engine. It is specifically designed to identify irregularities in financial ledgers, supply chain logistics, and corporate metadata. It's why companies pay us millions of dollars. We find the leaks before the ship sinks. My mother looked back and forth between us, her panic resurfacing. Chloe, please, just write the check. If you pay Blackwood Capital, this all goes away. Quiet, Brenda, my father barked. He turned his attention back to me, his eyes narrowing. Software doesn't change the fact that your signature is on those federal loan applications. It doesn't change the fact that the authorities are looking for the CFO. Liam let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He walked over to his briefcase, which he had set on the entryway table, and clicked the brass locks open. Richard, you really are operating in the dark ages, aren't you? Liam pulled out a slim black folder and walked back to the living room, dropping it right on top of the forged documents my father had produced. 7 months ago, Liam said, his voice carrying the lethal calm of a seasoned litigator. The Chief Information Security Officer at Aegis Flow, a man named Arthur Pendleton, noticed a series of bizarre API pings hitting our external servers. Someone was trying to digitally link a mid-sized Ohio trucking company to Aegis Flow's corporate credit profile. Arthur flagged it immediately and brought it to Chloe. All the color completely washed out of my father's face. He suddenly looked like a very old, very tired man. I didn't ignore it, I continued, stepping closer to them. I hired Stanton and Cross Forensics, a private auditing firm here in Chicago. It took them less than a week to uncover the shell companies Preston had set up. It took them another 48 hours to find the forged board resolutions and the fake CFO designation. You knew? My mother whispered, her voice trembling. For 7 months? I knew, I said. And because I am the CEO of a publicly traded subsidiary, failing to report corporate identity theft and federal wire fraud is a crime. So what do you think I did, Richard? My father didn't answer. His breathing had become shallow and erratic. I went to the FBI, I said, delivering the final, crushing blow. I walked into the Chicago field office on Roosevelt Road 6.5 months ago. I sat down with Special Agent Gregory Walsh from the White Collar Crime Division. I handed over every piece of metadata, every IP log, and the forensic accounting report proving that Preston Sterling, with the complicity of the CEO of Sterling Freight, was embezzling millions and committing federal fraud. No, my mother gasped, clutching her chest. No, Chloe, you wouldn't. We are your family. You made it very clear 15 years ago that I wasn't family, I replied, the ice in my veins completely frozen solid. Agent Walsh has been monitoring your accounts ever since. They knew Preston was fleeing before he even reached the Texas border. They let the bank seize the trucks last week to force your hand. They were waiting to see what your next move would be. My father stumbled backward, his cane slipping on the Persian rug. He caught himself on the arm of the sofa, his chest heaving. You You set us up." "No, Richard," Liam interjected, stepping between me and my father. "You set yourselves up. And just to put the final nail in the coffin of this little extortion attempt, Illinois is a two-party consent state for recording audio, unless there is a reasonable suspicion that a felony is being committed, such as extortion, under Title 18 U.S. Code, Section 1951. Liam pointed to the subtle, blinking red light on the security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. "You just walked into our home and threatened to perjure yourself to federal prosecutors unless my wife paid you $4 million. That is felony extortion, Richard, and Agent Walsh is listening to the live feed right now." The silence that followed Liam's revelation wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of complete and total annihilation. My father stared at the blinking red light on the security camera mounted in the corner of our ceiling, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish pulled from the water. The domineering patriarch, the man who had controlled every narrative, crushed every obstacle with sheer financial force, and dictated my worth based on his passing whims, was completely, undeniably powerless. Before either of them could formulate a response or attempt another lie, the heavy, unmistakable sound of multiple car doors slamming echoed from the street outside. My mother rushed to the front window, peeling back the heavy linen curtains. She let out a piercing, guttural scream that seemed to tear at her throat. 3 dark, unmarked SUVs had blocked our driveway, their red and blue grille lights strobing wildly against the falling November rain. Several figures wearing tactical windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI were walking briskly up our front walkway. "Richard!" my mother wailed, spinning around, tears streaming down her face, completely ruining her expensive mascara. "Richard, they're here! What do we do? What do we do?" My father didn't look at her. He didn't look at the window. He looked at me. For the first time in my 34 years of life, I saw genuine, unadulterated fear in his eyes. There was no defiance left. There was no manipulation. He was entirely broken. The karma he had spent decades dodging had finally arrived at his doorstep, and it was wearing a badge. "Chloe," he choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, reedy wheeze. "Please, I am an old man. I won't survive a federal prison. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we were just asking for a legitimate family loan." I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't pity. It wasn't triumph. It was an overwhelming sense of closure. The phantom chains that had tethered me to their approval, to their shadow, suddenly dissolved into dust. "You should have thought about that before you co-signed your son's crimes and tried to frame your daughter," I said, my voice steady, cold, and unwavering. The doorbell rang. It was a sharp, authoritative sound that demanded immediate compliance. Liam walked over, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the heavy oak door open. Standing on the porch was Special Agent Gregory Walsh. He was a tall, imposing man whose rigid posture, broad shoulders, and unyielding stare betrayed his former life as a United States Marine before he joined the Bureau's white-collar crime division. He held a thick stack of manila folders and executed warrants in his left hand. Behind him, 2 armed federal agents stood ready on the porch, the rain bouncing off their shoulders. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling?" Agent Walsh said, stepping into the foyer. His eyes bypassed Liam and me entirely, locking directly onto my parents with the predatory focus of a hawk. "Richard and Brenda Sterling?" My mother collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, her designer coat bunching up awkwardly around her. My father slowly raised his hands, dropping his cane. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the tense room. "Richard Sterling," Agent Walsh continued, his voice booming through the quiet house, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, and federal extortion. Brenda Sterling, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice and aiding and abetting a known fugitive." "Fugitive?" my father rasped, as a younger agent stepped forward, pulling Richard's arms roughly behind his back and snapping cold, heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. "Preston is gone. He's untraceable. You'll never find him." Agent Walsh offered a tight, humorless smile. "Actually, Mr. Sterling, we apprehended Preston 4 hours ago in Cabo San Lucas. Turns out your son isn't the criminal mastermind you thought he was. He tried to pay for a VIP cabana and 3 bottles of Don Julio at the Esperanza Resort, using a debit card linked to one of the very shell companies we've been tracking for 6 months. The Mexican federales pulled him out of a swimming pool. He was crying when they put him in the back of the cruiser. He's currently sitting in a concrete holding cell in Baja, California, awaiting extradition back to Ohio." My mother shrieked again, a raw, agonizing sound of pure defeat. The golden child, the boy they had sacrificed their entire lives, their business, and my future to protect, was the one who had driven the final nail into their coffin because he couldn't resist a luxury vacation while on the run from the federal government. The agents hauled them to their feet. As they walked my father toward the door, he stopped and turned his head, looking back at me one last time. He looked pathetic, small, erased. "You did this!" he spat, his voice trembling with a final, impotent rage. "You destroyed this family." "No, Richard," I replied, standing tall beside my husband, wrapping my arm around Liam's waist. "I just refused to let you destroy me. Have a safe trip back to Columbus." They led them out into the freezing November rain. Liam closed the door, throwing the deadbolt with a solid, satisfying click. The sudden quiet in the house was profound. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating, walking on eggshells silence of Arlington Avenue. It was the peaceful, ringing silence of a storm that had finally passed. The fallout over the next year was brutal, highly public, and utterly absolute. The trial, United States versus Richard Sterling, was a media circus that dominated the Midwestern news cycle. Preston, true to his cowardly, self-serving nature, immediately turned state's evidence, attempting to testify against our father in a desperate bid for a reduced sentence. It didn't work the way he hoped. The presiding judge, an incredibly strict and no-nonsense federal magistrate named Harrison Bennett, saw right through the Sterling men. Lead prosecutor Abigail Harper used the pristine data from Aegis Flow and the Stanton and Cross forensics report to map out the entire embezzlement scheme step by step for the jury. Preston was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny, wire fraud, identity theft, and tax evasion. My father, Richard, was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 12 years. Given his advanced age and rapidly failing health, Judge Bennett's gavel effectively handed him a life sentence behind bars. My mother, Brenda, managed to avoid prison time by pleading guilty to lesser charges of obstruction and testifying that Richard forced her to participate in the cover-up. But freedom was her only victory. She lost absolutely everything else. The bank foreclosed on the sprawling Arlington Avenue estate, auctioning off her designer clothes, the luxury cars, the country club memberships, and every piece of jewelry she owned just to make a dent in the restitution owed to the devastated employee pension fund. The woman who used to host $1,000-a-plate charity galas and look down her nose at anyone who didn't wear Prada met the hardest karma of all. Last I heard from a mutual acquaintance, Brenda was living in a cramped, mouldy, one-bedroom apartment in a rough neighborhood in Dayton. To pay her rent, She was working the chaotic breakfast shift as a waitress at a greasy, 24-hour diner called Rusty's. She spends her days on her aching feet, wearing a stained uniform, pouring cheap coffee, and wiping down sticky tables for truck drivers and college students who don't leave tips. I never spoke to them again. I didn't gloat, I didn't visit them in prison, and I certainly never stopped at Rusty's for a cup of coffee. I simply went back to my beautiful life. Aegis Flow continued to thrive and expand globally. Liam and I adopted another golden retriever, and we spent our holidays exactly how we wanted, surrounded by friends, mentors, and people who actually loved us for who we were, not what they could extract from us. The ghosts of Arlington Avenue were finally laid to rest. Family isn't defined by shared bloodlines. It's defined by mutual respect and care. My parents spent their lives investing in a mirage, ultimately ignoring the one daughter who could have saved them. In the end, they didn't just lose their wealth, they lost their freedom. I closed the door on the sterling legacy forever, not with anger, but with the quiet peace of a ghost who finally found her home.